Well, good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American-German Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm going to hand things over in just a moment to my colleague, Eric Langenbacher, who is the senior fellow and director of our program on society, culture, and politics. And we've got a great discussion in store about German energy policy, and with an author who's going to bring great perspectives. And I think we're all going to find this quite enlightening. So, Eric, the floor is yours, and I will be watching in rapt attention.
Thank you, Jeff. It's really my great pleasure to briefly introduce our speaker today, who's going to be talking about his brand new book, hot off the press. I guess it's been out for about 4 weeks now, called Energy and Power, Germany in the Age of Oil, Atoms, and Climate Change, which is a history, actually, of German energy policy in the post-war period. So Dr. Stephen G. Gross is an associate professor of history, as well as the director of the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies at New York University. Interestingly, he worked at the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the Department of Commerce before finishing his PhD in history from UC Berkeley back in 2010. His first book was called Export Empire, German Soft Power in Southeastern Europe, 1890 to 1945. And since then, he has shifted his research focus a little bit, looking more at the history of energy and climate change. So without further ado, we will hand the floor over to Dr. Gross. He will present for a few minutes, maybe 20 minutes, on the book, its arguments, its main findings, and then we will pivot to a moderated Q&A session. So I would ask all participants who have questions to please type your question into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then I will perhaps collect, amalgamate questions, and then pose them to Dr. Gross. But without further ado, Stephen.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody at AGI and Eric and Jack and Jeff and Elizabeth for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen to make sure it's working okay. Can you see that all right? Great.
Perfect.
Yeah, so I'm here to talk about this book that just came out that I've been working on for about 7 years about German energy policy since 1945. I first got interested in energy policy when I was actually in Berlin doing research for my first book. I was there in 2008 and 2009 in the winter when Russia and Ukraine got into a gas dispute and shut off the gas lines, and it created kind of this stir in the German media and Eastern European media, and it just alerted me just how politicized and contentious energy was as a subject in German society in general. And the more I looked into it, I realized that there are these great books on individual fuel types, about nuclear power, about oil, a lot about coal, but there wasn't really a book that put everything together into one comprehensive history of how Germans have thought about and approached policy and energy making. And I think that this last year in 2022 has really kind of illustrated or underscored how important energy is to German society. We have this natural gas-induced energy crisis that's a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that kind of led to fears of German deindustrialization and a recession. At the same time, just these incredible heat waves in 2022 that kind of reaffirmed for everybody in Europe just how imminent the climate catastrophe was. And it seems like today is a moment in which geopolitics and economics and global warming seem to be interacting in ways that they haven't ever before. And so I'm a historian. I only in the coda of the book really touch on more recent developments. And really what I wanted to understand in writing this book was what I call, taking from Helmut Walzer-Smith, the vanishing point of the 1990s and the early 2000s. And this is the horrible paradox that humanity and natural scientists knew with increasing clarity by the 1990s that we were on the cusp of irreversible climate change. And yet there was very little concrete policy, both at the national level and at the international level, that was addressing climate change in any capacity. And so, for historians, I think that this is a new period to really look at and to understand this paradox of political inaction in the face of overwhelming evidence of climate change. But in some respects, Germany, the Federal Republic, was a country that actually did try to change its energy system under a new red-green coalition after 1998. Around 2000, the nation embarked on this pioneering energy transition to rebuild its economy on a renewable foundation, and also to pair this with energy efficiency, what today we call the Energiewende. Here's a graph just showing just how far ahead Germans were in installed solar capacity, that Germany really was the world market for solar panels in the early 2000s before China superseded them. And this was done through a series of groundbreaking laws that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But this Energiewende has run into major problems. The wind doesn't always blow, and the sun doesn't always shine. And in some ways, the very success of the Energiewende has made it harder for Germans to turn off their coal plants and to close down their natural gas power plants, because they're also phasing out nuclear power. And it's remarkable how polarizing this is in German society, how it really divides the nation, that some people call the Energiewende one of the greatest social experiments in German history. Other people call it a crime against future generations, or a lunatic gamble that's going to deindustrialize the nation. And so how did this come to be? How historically did energy become such a charged topic in German history? How did it become so entangled with other areas of policymaking? And why did the nation embark on a risky policy of trying to move to a carbon-free energy system in 2000? These are some of the questions that my book, Energy and Power, tries to answer. But it also answers, or tries to ask, what Germany's experience with energy transitions can teach us about the nature of energy transitions in general. We face this task to move off of fossil fuels on a global scale and to implement an energy transition. I think there's much that we can learn from German history. And so the premise of my book is really threefold. And the first is that post-war German history has a lot to teach us about energy transitions, about how and why they happen. Germany, I argue, went through 5 different energy transitions since 1945. First, the rise of oil, then the rise of nuclear power, which in many ways was a stalled transition, then a turn towards energy efficiency in the 1970s and 80s, then the rise of natural gas, and then last but not least, the rise of renewables. And so exploring these sequences of energy transitions, I argue, can help us understand how transitions happen in general. Second, I argue that energy is entangled with many other processes in German history, and that exploring energy can help us understand these kind of big landmarks of German history better, like the economic miracle or 1989 in new and innovative ways. And third, I argue that the story behind how energy became politicized in Germany is crucial to German history more broadly, and that this begins much earlier than I think many people often realize. That there's kind of a standard narrative that historians and also activists take when they try and explain Germany's peculiar and peculiarly green energy trajectory. They look at political outsiders, the anti-nuclear movement in the 1970s, the rise of the Green Party in the 1980s, and they argue that these activists and protesters and tinkerers really drove Germany down a new energy path. As the authors of one kind of big book on this say, that the Energiewende was a transition, quote, from the people, not from the government. But I argue that these kind of create a triumphalist narrative that activism is really all that it takes. And instead, I show how Germany's trajectory in energy affairs was shaped by a combination of political insiders and by these political outsiders. And that in particular, these political insiders, meaning Reform social democrats, mainstream energy experts, key unions, some major industries and big export sectors, all in the 1980s and 1990s got on board changing Germany's energy system in a greener direction, and that this is how we should understand Germany's path in the 1980s and the 1990s. And instead of focusing only on markets to understand energy transitions, this is how a lot of economists talk about energy transitions, that it's all about the price. And once the price of an energy falls low enough that people will use that more than other energies. I argue that we need to look at a broader range of actors and understand questions of mobilization to understand energy transitions. And here I draw on the writings of Hermann Scheer, who's one of the protagonists in my book, the social democratic reformer who was pivotal in launching groundbreaking energy reform in the 1990s. Scheer argued that energy transitions are not some smooth and easy shift from one fuel to another, but they're political battles with very clear winners and very clear losers, and that these battles play out in the realm of politics as much as they do in the realm of economics. And so I have this kind of schema that I lay out in the introduction, and I'm happy to unpack this more in the Q&A about how we need to look at not only markets, but also states and political parties and social groups. And then we also have to understand how these actors link energy to other policy issues like exports and jobs, how they build coalitions around energy, political coalitions, how they can manipulate and exploit ideas about the future and visions of the future, and how they can also exploit crises to call for change. And so all of these elements help us understand how and why energy transitions have happened in Germany, and I think they can help us understand how and why transitions happen more broadly. So I want to just now give kind of two examples from my book to help illustrate how I work with some of these ideas. And the first is the shift from coal to oil, what I call the first energy transition in Germany. And I really begin the book with the concept of a rupture. That historians, we like to talk about continuity versus rupture. And in the case of Germany, the political rupture of 1945, the collapse of the Third Reich, the occupation of Germany by the Allies, this is really a profound rupture in the standpoint of politics. But from the standpoint of energy, in many ways, the more profound rupture or change comes in the 1950s and the 1960s. That in 1945, even in as late as the early 1950s, West Germany, the Federal Republic, and East Germany still had both feet rooted in an older, low energy system that was based on coal. Through the 1950s, most German farms still ran on the muscle power of animals. Household energy appliances were fairly rare. They were a luxury. And cars were a rarity as well. In the mid-1950s, Germany's per capita energy consumption was about the same as it was in 1913. So little had changed since the eve of World War I. But by contrast, America already by really the 1930s and 40s and 50s was a high energy society. So there's a very stark contrast between German and American society. And West Germany was really rooted in coal, that hard coal was the predominant source of its energy system. But in the late 1950s, this began to change. And during these years, West Germany really experienced one of the most intense energy transitions of all time in the matter of just 20 years. So really 2 decades. Oil went from being just 5% of the energy energy usage to encompassing over 50% of the nation's primary energy system. And so this massive oil wave would reshape German society. And it did so because it threatened the hard coal sector that was the foundation of economic and social life in the Ruhr, which is the industrial center of Germany. This is where 500,000 people were employed in the mines. We often hear that Europe and Germany adopted oil because it was inherently cheaper or a better fuel than coal. But in fact, the rise of oil in Germany and in Europe more broadly was very much the result of a conscious political strategy on the part of American leaders, but also on the part of Ludwig Erhard, the economics minister. After 1945, America created a security umbrella to protect Mideastern oil. It used a lot of Marshall Plan aid to build up refineries in Germany. It had massive tax write-offs for American multinational oil companies. Erhard then himself in Germany paired this with a policy of cheap loans and subsidies to promote the use of oil. And this, in doing so, Erhard very clearly linked oil to the hope of having cheap energy for exports, that he realized Germany was an export-based economy and that it had to transition to oil to have a cheaper source of energy. Now, this first post-war energy transition triggered a number of energy crises. For one, do I have a map here? Yeah, for the first one came with the Suez Canal crisis in 1956, when Gamal Nasser responded to the French and British invasion of Egypt by blocking the Suez Canal, and his Arab allies blew up the pipelines that pumped oil to the Eastern Mediterranean, and this blocked a major artery in this kind of global hydrocarbon supply chain. So all of a sudden, Germany's new source of energetic abundance seemed to be outside of their control. A second energy crisis erupted in 1958. This was the first coal crisis, where there was actually too much energy, kind of a mild winter, a cyclical downturn led energy use to decline. Coal piled up at the pits in the Ruhr. Tens of thousands of miners were thrown on unemployment. Adenauer and Erhard feared that there was going to be social dislocation and social protest in the Ruhr. And you see some of the largest protests in German history, West German history, up until that point. 60, 80,000 miners protesting in Bochum and Bonn, coming out waving black flags, saying that Erhard is destroying the oil industry, destroying the coal industry. A second coal crisis then erupted in 1966 that led to the closing of even more mines. Again, this is a result of an abundance of energy, having too much energy. And the result was just a staggering loss of jobs in the mining sector. This led energy to become intensely politicized in Germany, well before what we typically take as the moment in America when energy became politicized, which is the 1973 oil shock. This is happening already in Germany in the 1960s because of these energy crises. It led key figures, including Chancellor Adenauer himself, and then later Ludwig Erhard, to realize that energy was too important to be left entirely to the market, and that energy was a public good, and that its price was a political price. And this is kind of where I begin the story. Then let me jump ahead to talk about the 1970s, the 1980s. If the 50s and the 60s events and energy crises began to politicize energy in Germany, events in the 1970s and the 1980s really created the conditions for Germans to change their approach to energy. And while the spark came from a grassroots movement, the course of this change in how Germans thought about energy was profoundly shaped by conventional politicians and mainstream experts as well. And so this is kind of part of a new story that I'm telling. Energy began to become further politicized with the publication of the Club of Rome Limits to Growth report, and then the first oil shock of 1973. And I'm happy to talk more about those in the Q&A. And one response to the oil shock of 1973 was an expanded campaign to build nuclear power as a way to supplement the nation's energy system. And this led to a major social backlash. The anti-nuclear protests, and many people have written about this. These reached a climax of sorts in 1976 and 1977, when you have protesters kind of becoming partially violent. You have the largest police deployment in the history of the Federal Republic to suppress the protests. And in response to this, a highly eclectic social movement emerges that crystallizes around the question of nuclear power and energy in general. And so this history of the anti-nuclear movement is well known. What my book does is it tries to kind of tell a slightly different story. And the first point is about why this anti-nuclear movement was so successful. This is kind of one of the big kind of questions, I think, in European history, is why the German anti-nuclear movement becomes so powerful in a place like France. It does not, which is right across the Rhine. And one reason is that German protesters were able to link questions of energy and nuclear power to fears of a resurgence of political authoritarianism and to the Third Reich itself. There was this deep-rooted anxiety among the anti-nuclear movement that ecological collapse lay on the horizon if Germany and the world in general did not stop the pursuit of reckless, quantitative, infinite growth. And this growth required more energy, and supplying ever more amounts of energy created the need for complex technology. This is kind of the argument that develops among the nuclear movement. And this energy technology was becoming so complicated that it could not be overseen by any single entity, even the modern state. And so this was political danger. This was politically dangerous. And these anxieties gained an evocative name when the journalist Robert Jung coined the term the Atomstaat, the atomic state. Here's a copy of the book with the English translation that said this kind of energy technology is going to lead to a security state around nuclear reactors, and that he rhetorically linked this to the Third Reich. And of course, Germany was, during the 1970s, was going through a very kind of visceral internal reflection about the relationship of German society in general to the Third Reich. And so this helps, this linkage helps explain why the anti-nuclear movement, I think, had such a widespread purchase. Now, the solution to this matrix of big technology and big big state overreach oddly came from the United States, at least in its conceptual framework. And this is the idea of a soft energy path this is a concept coined by Amory Lovins, an American physicist. He said that there's this hard energy path that relies on centralized, supply-oriented energy systems that use complicated technology. But there's an alternative path called the soft path that would use small-scale, decentralized, flexible, sustainable technology and diverse energy sources. And so the anti-nuclear movement began to adopt these ideas of the soft path. You see Lovins being translated into German, and the anti-nuclear movement using his concept of a soft path to justify some sort of energy transition away from nuclear power and really even oil in the 1970s and the 1980s. And so this idea of transitioning Germany's energy system was, not really about the environment at first. It was more about preserving democracy. But one thing that I also show is that the Social Democrats had a big role in kind of spreading these ideas to other aspects of German society. That the SPD linked this idea of the soft path to other traditional concerns in German society, like jobs and like exports, and that helped take it mainstream in a way. Social Democrats adopted these ideas in part because they were afraid that the emerging anti-nuclear and then Green Party was going to take away votes on the left, and it represented a political threat. The Social Democrats had their own kind of robust reform movement led by Erhard Epler, pictured here with Helmut Schmidt, who already in 1972 and 73 was talking about the need for a new type of qualitative growth. So he was already thinking in these kind of new terms about how we need to reimagine growth even before the rise of the anti-nuclear movement. And he began to argue that the Social Democrats should promote this soft path and try to save energy, and that use more workers to apply insulation on buildings, to use local energy supplies, create district heating systems, apply heat pumps throughout society, and that this would also be a source of jobs. And in these debates, Epler found allies in a new cohort of mainstream energy experts who began to kind of think about energy savings as a new energy source, and they began to say, look, if we save energy, this is even better than finding a new source of energy, because this is something that's domestically under our own control. And here, a key player was Volker Hauff, who just before the Social Democrats lost power, he helped orchestrate the idea of an energy tax as a way to kind of control energy usage and to shape and guide consumer behavior so consumers would use less energy. And he also said that renewables and energy savings are going to be the big new export markets in the global economy, and that Germany should aspire to be a global leader in these because it's going to create a lot of jobs, because Germany will be able to export energy savings technology and eventually even wind and solar power. So Hauf and the SPD and Epler, helped link the idea of green energy and energy savings to new or to older, more traditional concerns. It wasn't only about the environment for them. It was much about, carving out new export niches and generating jobs at home. And so these ideas that the Social Democrats and the Greens had didn't find much policy resonance before 1982. I mean, the Social Democrats did pass some, major energy efficiency legislation in the late 1970s, and so you do see the Federal Republic begin to diverge to a certain extent in its energy usage per capita from other countries like Britain and France and America in the 1970s. But really, it's when this coalition comes together in the late 1990s under a red-green framework after 1998 that these ideas that were born in the 1970s and the 1980s get applied in concrete policy and concrete legislation. The most important of these is the electricity feed-in law that basically gives a high fixed guaranteed price, a political price for the producers of wind and solar power, guaranteeing them, incredible profits. But this was complemented by an array of other policies that also tried to set a political price for energy, an eco tax, and really using the big state-owned public bank, the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, to give hugely subsidized loans to solar and wind producers in 2000. And so as a result of this, you see Germany embark on its fifth energy transition, the shift towards renewables, when it became profitable, very much so, to turn to building green energy systems. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to talk about the details and about other aspects of these energy transitions, or about natural gas and the oil shock more generally, or what's happened since 2000. Thanks, Eric. Here.
All right, thanks so much, Stephen. That was hugely fascinating. I would just remind all of our participants that if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I will collate the questions and then pose them to Professor Gross. But maybe while people are getting around to typing things up, I'll start with some questions myself, or just some observations, maybe things to explore a little bit more. Yeah. Maybe because this kind of resonates with my own kind of like research interests, I was really kind of struck by the point that you made, how in the 1970s, atomic energy or energy dependence more generally was linked to fears of authoritarianism, and in particular, fears of a recurrence of the Nazi past. I mean, I, for one, have long thought that it's impossible to understand the post-war Federal Republic without understanding the impact of the past and all these different myriad efforts to try to come to terms with it. But I have to say, I never thought about a connection, a linkage, as you, I think, so rightfully said, between kind of energy concerns and the Nazi past. Could you maybe just expand on that linkage just a little bit more? Because it doesn't seem entirely intuitive.
Yeah. And I think it's not entirely intuitive. There are a certain number of hoops that one has to jump through to make these arguments. I'll begin by saying that the 1970s, as I mentioned, were a moment of when Germans were kind of reconciling themselves to the past and doing a lot of hard work to think about how the Nazi past fits into the current generation. This began in '68, but then you have Willy Brandt's Kniefall in Warsaw. You have, at the end of the decade, the Holocaust miniseries come out. So this is a particularly important decade, right? And so somebody well, actually, it begins with people like E.F. Schumacher. Small is Beautiful, right? This book really resonated in Germany, and he actually, is German who immigrates to Britain, works with the British National Coal Board, this huge organization, and he sees problems of authoritarianism that emerge with centralized power. So this is a critique that had been actually on the right of the political spectrum back in the 50s, but it kind of shifts, and the left adopts this critique in Germany and elsewhere that says that, you know, controlling and managing big scale energy systems requires a big state, and that this has the possibility to get out of control. So this is a way that, you know, that Jung, I think, Robert Jung kind of makes this most clear in his book Atomstaat, where he talks about how protecting nuclear fissile materials requires a security state that's going to overreach, that protecting nuclear facilities also requires states to think not just on a scale of 1 to 2 years, but to think generationally, and that's kind of a new capacity that the state has to have, and that this is dangerous. So, you know, I think these arguments are hyperbolic, but because so much kind of thinking is going on in German society in the 1970s about, you know, how the Third Reich fits into the past, that these have more purchase in Germany. They you know, you see similar arguments in France. There's been a lot of great work by Stephen Milder and Andrew Tompkins that look at kind of comparative French and German protest movements. And, you know, this is an argument that they make as well, that you know, in France, it's a centralized state, but there's also not this kind of these political overtones. And yeah.
Well, just one little follow-up, and then I know that Jeff has a question too, because I really like this France-Germany distinction, which I think is also quite kind of important to understand. And so essentially what you're saying is the French have always been more comfortable with centralized government, and therefore they didn't see the same threat that many Germans did. But I also can't help but think that this ties also into kind of, let's call it German parochialism, right? And the fact that, you know, Germany was divided for so long and people take their parochial Heimat very seriously, decentralization, federalism and stuff like that. So it seems that the argument also kind of piggybacked or coincided with this kind of German, you know, preference for more kind of decentralized control.
Yeah, and France has a very centralized electricity system. It's run by Électricité de France, EDF, which is this massive corporation, right? That is a state-run corporation that controls the entire grid, and so they're pro-nuclear, and there's very little space because their electricity system is so centralized for these ideas to gain purchase. Whereas Germany has a decentralized electricity grid that's, you know, owned by different big companies, but also some small companies and local municipalities. And these local municipalities begin to experiment with new types of systems. There's also in France, nuclear energy gets very much wedded to geopolitical ambitions in a way that it does not in Germany.
Great.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephen, for a really fascinating presentation. I wanted to pick up on the kind of the politics of energy, which you addressed in your opening remarks. You might be familiar with a book recently published in Germany called Die Moscow Connection, which is about the SPD energy economy, if you want to call it that, the energy political economy, especially throughout the time when Gerhard Schröder was chancellor, and how circles that originated to a large extent in Lower Saxony became the defining figures in Germany's shift to natural gas and the energy dependency on Russia. That's one slice of the ways Germany's energy policy and the political parties have engaged, but of course that leaves out the fact that the CDU has been in power or shared power the largest portion of the post-war period, and you've had important parties like the FDP also playing key roles. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the ways in which energy has been central to political leaders in the last few decades, beyond the obvious example of Gerhard Schröder.
Yeah, well, let me go back in the story of natural gas, which I think is an important, hugely important story. Actually, as I was writing the book, I submitted it to Oxford Russia invaded Ukraine, and the reviewers were like, you have to bring all your natural gas things together into a single chapter, which is understandable, and to really go into some more depth about that. And this kind of turn towards the east, and turn towards Russia as a source of natural gas was, which I argue that Germany co-produced this big infrastructure that brings gas from Siberia to the heart of Central Europe with Russia. That this was a social democratic project initially, and it was seen, and this is not my own findings, people know this, that it was seen as a spearhead of Ostpolitik, as a way to kind of overcome Cold War divisions, and a commercial way to do so. Already in 1969, before kind of Brandt and Egon Barr's Ostpolitik began to really reach a crescendo, that this natural gas deal between the Germans and the Russians was one of the first things that kind of got the ball rolling. And then it was continued by the SPD in the 1980s, in the face of very big resistance from America that was afraid the Germans were becoming dependent on Russian Soviet hydrocarbons. But Helmut Schmidt, the chancellor, and other leaders in the SPD very clearly said, we're going to go ahead with this, not only because it's about energy, but also because it's about jobs, that we have big marquee German companies like Mannesmann and AEG who are, having, hundreds, thousands of people employed building the pipes that are going to connect us with Russia. And this is at a moment of kind of German recession, right, in the early 1980s, a very high unemployment. The CDU then comes in the picture in the 1990s when they pursue a general policy of liberalization, right? They're not kind of as neoliberal as, as America in the 1980s and the 1990s, but they do have some neoliberal proclivities, and they try to liberalize the energy sector, which allows Gazprom to enter into the German market in a more kind of powerful way than it had, or in a more kind of deep presence than it had in the 1980s. And part of this is actually from the standpoint of German companies, above all BASF. This is a way to kind of get away from the quasi-monopoly that kind of big energy companies, Ruhrgas in particular, have on the gas market, and so they turn to Gazprom and Soviet gas as a cheaper alternative to kind of a monopolized market. And so the CDU is very much in favor of this in the 1990s, and that's when Gazprom begins to buy up a lot of German infrastructure already, and kind of cut deals with BASF and Wintershall to exchange technology for the rights to Russian gas in Siberia. So both parties are implicated in building this network. It begins as a social democratic project. The CDU continues it, and I think that the story becomes even more complicated after 2000, once Schroeder joins joins Nord Stream's board of directors, but this is part of a longer history of how Germans, both parties, I argue, put energy and cheap energy and jobs at a higher level, or a higher priority, than kind of transatlantic relations, right? The Yamal pipeline controversy, the Germans clearly side with cheap energy over the transatlantic alliance. There's actually another incident of building nuclear reactors with German companies in Brazil in the 1970s that America really pushes back against, and the Germans say, no, we're going to go ahead and do this anyhow because it's going to generate jobs for us during a period of economic downturn. So I think both parties are very implicated in prioritizing cheap energy and jobs over kind of geopolitical and ideological concerns.
Thanks. If I could ask a follow-up, are there figures within the CDU from that period, especially in the 1990s, as you described, when when Ruhrgas lost its monopoly, de facto monopoly power, and you had the changing gas market? Are there particular figures who stand out in your view in shaping intellectually and politically those possibilities?
Rexroth, who was Gunter Rexroth, who was the economics minister. I mean, he was
FDP though, right?
Yeah. So yeah. Not CDU, but he was a big figure in really advancing the idea of liberalization. This is a bigger European-wide story as well. That Brussels and the EU Commission was very interested in liberalizing European energy markets. This is under Leon Britton, competition commissioner. Actually, there's kind of a whole British angle to this. A lot of British neoliberal thinkers come to Brussels, help implement this neoliberal energy policy in the 1990s. First, the Germans are not supportive of it, but under Rexroth, they become more supportive. And so he's a key figure in pushing this forward. Merkel doesn't play as big of a role in the 1990s in the natural gas story, but she does in the nuclear story as well. She's environmental minister, and is actually keen on pushing nuclear faster, and not necessarily building more reactors, but continuing the use of nuclear fuel and expanding the capacity of nuclear reactors. So she does play a role in this, but not in the natural gas sector.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
So I'd like to return for a second to some of these earlier instances of transition, especially, I guess, the rupture, as you put it, when Germany transitioned from reliance on coal to a reliance of oil in the 50s and the 60s. And you said something that really kind of intrigued me, which was the role of US policymakers in kind of pushing the Germans towards that transition. Again, maybe you could unpack that or provide a few more details. So, what was in it for us? Why would we have used Marshall Plan aid and tax write-offs and things like that? Why would we have pushed that on the Germans?
Yeah, well, so it's probably not, part of the story is not necessarily pushing this on the Germans, but helping American companies get oil outside of America. That there's a longer history. During World War II, the American Department of the Interior becomes very concerned about oil supplies. Obviously, they become interested in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. These fields had been discovered before World War II, but then the U.S. strikes, at the end of the war in 46, 47, strikes this, close relationship with Saudi Arabia. And they are, American leaders are concerned with protecting and safeguarding this enormous pool of oil in the Middle East for the free world and not for the communist world, right? So this is there's another story to Truman supporting Greece and Turkey, that this is partly about creating a cordon sanitaire so the Russians can't as easily move in and get a Mideastern oil. Then there's a whole domestic story that American domestic oil producers are then worried that cheap Middle East oil is going to flood into America and undercut them. And so they lobby Eisenhower, and they get him to put on oil quotas that get formalized in 1959 that effectively bifurcate the global oil economy and make America one kind of oil system and the rest of the world, Europe, another oil system. So then a lot of this Middle Eastern oil can't get into America, and it goes to Europe. The big Seven Sisters, Exxon, Shell, BP, that they sell to Europe because that's where they can, and above all, they sell to Germany because Germany has the most liberal oil market under Erhard. It doesn't have high tariffs. France and Britain, control the price of oil. They control oil imports. So Germany has the kind of loosest market, and it's very easy to sell excess capacity in Germany. And so you actually see Germany having, one of the lowest prices of oil in the 1960s. And then that gets reversed in the 1970s. This liberal market, once global oil prices go up, it gets hammered even harder in Germany than it does in America. So there's that. There's the Marshall Plan is very clearly aimed at economic growth. And, this isn't my own research, but other historians have, unpacked like where Marshall Plan funding goes. A lot goes to rebuild the coal sector, but a lot goes to expand refinery capacity. Part of this is Again, benefiting American companies that they are given, certain privileges to sell in the German market, but part of it is also the idea of generating wealth and income and development as a way to protect against Bolshevism. So there's a lot going on in the 1950s with how oil is, it's a political market, right? So just to back up, that there's this story by energy historians and economic historians that say, well, oil triumphed because it was cheap and abundant. But if you look in the details, that the price is always politically controlled. It's the price of oil globally traded is set by the posted price, which is negotiated by the big oil companies and the producer states like Iran and Saudi Arabia, and it's not a market price. And in fact, there's a big German inquiry into this in 1955 and 1956, and they conclude, look, that this oil is very much a political price, and this kind of gives us a new sense about what the economic miracle looks like. That it's kind of touted as this, this great free market thing, and there's a lot to that. But if you look at energy prices, that it's not so free after all. So that's part of the story I try and tell.
Jeff, you have another question?
If I could pick up on that, the sort of the myth of cheap oil, and because there's also what I believe is probably a myth, but I'd really appreciate your perspective on of cheap gas, which was kind of the story of the 90s, and especially of the post or the period after Schroeder's chancellorship, when the German energy relationship with Russia takes an even more intense turn, despite worsening geopolitical conditions and tensions with Russia. The argument was always cheap gas, although it seems, at least from some research that I'm familiar with, that the per energy unit costs in Germany coming from natural gas were no more advantageous for German industry than in other European countries. So is this idea of Germany benefiting from cheap gas because of its relationship with Russia a myth? And B, if it is a myth, how would you explain its dominance in the information space?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a full answer to this, but I think part of it comes from the 1990s, when there was effectively cheap Russian gas flooding not just the German market, but the European market in general. I think as a caveat, it's important to remember that Italy also has been very deeply connected with Russian gas, that ENI, their large energy company, was one of the first to conclude gas contracts and to help kind of further this East-West relationship. And that the Russian economy collapses in 1990, energy demand collapses as well, dramatically. It's one of these weird moments where you look at decarbonization and you see decarbonization happening in Eastern Europe and Russia, not for any good reasons, but because of economic collapse. And so Gazprom is sitting on this mountain of natural gas that it, no longer has a domestic market for. And so this begins to move into Western Europe. Jonathan Stern, who was an energy analyst in the 90s and continued writing, he calls this the Russian natural gas bubble. And so for a while there was cheap natural gas, but it wasn't only Germans who were benefiting from this. I think that they bought the bulk of it, but other European countries, Austria in particular, also benefited from it. But then the natural gas, natural gas markets are kind of weird. They're, for a while, up until the early 2000s, sold on, the prices determined by these long-term opaque contracts. So it's actually very hard to understand who's paying what. There's this kind of very opaque person-to-person natural gas network between Russians and Germans, and the gas contracts. It's hard to understand who's paying what. This begins to change with liberalization, and then the Russians actually begin to lose market share after kind of the mid-2000s, in part because of the American shale gas boom. So it's, combination of the Euro crisis reduces European demand for gas. American shale gas boom happens. It doesn't necessarily displace Russian gas, but it means that more other suppliers, instead of selling to America, then sell to Europe. And so Gazprom actually begins to lose market share. And so then there's kind of a renewed effort by Gazprom after like 2012 or 13 to then kind of recapture lost share. And so I think that's when you also see gas prices decline a little bit. But it's hard for me to make heads or tail of whether German industry in particular is benefiting from this. Like certain companies might be. BASF, again, is the example, this huge, chemical conglomerate that uses a lot of energy, and they very specifically align with Gazprom to get access through long-term contracts. Whether they're cheap is another thing, but what I would say that's it's more important is these contracts allow for predictability in what is otherwise a very volatile market, and so that BASF benefits from knowing what it's paying for gas for the next 20 years instead of having to go to the spot market and buy high or buy low. Yeah, sorry, it's not a clear answer to that question.
All right, I see that we're starting to come to the end of our time, so I would ask any attendees, if you have questions, now is your time to put them into the Q&A function. But I'd like to go big picture for one more second.
Yeah.
So, Stephen, you mentioned that Germany's gone through at least 5 energy transitions since 1945. I think you made the very good point, with which I agree wholeheartedly, that there are perhaps lessons and takeaways from the German experience. So when you take all these 5 transitions together, what would be the most important kind of lingering points that we should learn from them?
All right. Well, one is that appeals to climate change and environmental protection, I think, are not enough to galvanize public opinion to change an energy system. That I think it's always taken energy to be linked to other kind of longer standing issues of security, geopolitical security, or of exports or of jobs. And so selling any green transition, I think, is going to be hard. And it's, you're going to have to make the case not only based on climate change, but based on other factors. And here I think 2022 is a great example. In the case of Germany, what's going on now, that they're, in the short term, Russia invasion of Ukraine, reducing gas supplies has led to an energy crisis last year, led to a resurgence of German coal use. But on the other hand, it revived arguments that the Greens had been making since 2000 that renewables and energy savings are a domestic, secure, geopolitically reliable source of energy. And so this is an example of how, it's not about climate, but it's about security and energy, autarky almost, that has a possibility to propel this green energy transition further. I think, I'm also a big proponent, as I said in the introduction, of Hermann Scheer's point that these are political battles, that there are winners and losers, and it's not like the hydrocarbon industry is going to wither away, and they're going to go fighting tooth and nail. And you can find very interesting examples from German history about how this has been handled in the past. That there is this transition from oil, from coal to oil. Hard coal to oil. So what happened to the hard coal industry? They fought it tooth and nail. There are a lot of bad assets, underwater assets, right? We hear that in the hydrocarbon industry today. That very much the same thing happened with the mines in the Ruhr in the 1950s and 1960s. No company wanted to buy these things, right? They were losing value. So what happened? The German state had to come in basically with a huge billion-dollar package to create this massive kind of bad bank or bad coal company that absorbed a lot of losses. And that could potentially be a model. It was very expensive for the taxpayer, but it did avoid the dislocation of unemployment, and it allowed companies that had invested money in coal to get out, right, without losing a lot of money. So this is an example that I point to about how we can think about the state actively kind of helping minimize this political battle. Jeff, yeah.
I think this is all fascinating, and I want to pick up on one element of the transition away from coal that you highlighted, and that is the foundation or the German propensity to create structures, institutions that manage these transitions. So, for example, in the case of the coal transition, you have the RAG Foundation, and which is there to, in a sense, deal with the consequences, both economic but also social, of these transitions. And I'd be curious, do you see those ultimately being effective, and do they have maybe unintended or other consequences? Do they gain political influence or political weight that lingers long beyond that coal transition, for example? How do those manifest themselves in the German political and social system?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so Germany has kind of successfully created these corporatist institutions to manage energy transitions. RAG is an example. The first parliamentary inquiry into coal was had different stakeholders. You had the oil people involved, coal people, nuclear experts. This is in 1960. You see this again with the parliamentary inquiry into climate change in the 1980s. There's a nuclear inquiry in 1980. Most recently, the Coal Commission in 2019 that is aimed to phase out lignite coal. And I think that this is a decent model for phasing out and from an energy and for managing an energy transition to get different stakeholders. It's messy. Environmentalists were not happy with the Coal Commission of 2019, but on the other hand, it did set a schedule. It's not as fast as we'd like it to be, but in the absence of the commission, maybe nothing would have been done. But I do think that it does, create then, going back to the example of hard coal, it does create then an institution that represents the old energy that then stays around for a while, like RAG, stayed around in the 70s and 80s and lobbied very heavily for the coal penny and drove up power costs as a way, with the argument that we need to preserve the mining lifestyle of the Ruhr and prevent further social dislocation. So there are certainly risks, but it's hard to think of another model that's worked out. There's the tax model, right? Imposing taxes or imposing cap and trade, but we haven't seen that work very well at the European level. The cap and trade system hasn't worked. Now it's beginning to work a little bit better. Britain did actually implement more of a some type of energy tax, I think, in the early 2000s that was robust, but that failed on the EU level. So no solution is easy. And I think that this is another lesson from German history, that getting stakeholders involved in kind of a corporatist institution can be a way forward.
Well, on that note, I think we're probably out of questions for now, but what a rich and wonderful book that you have published. And thank you, Dr. Stephen Gross, for spending the time to unpack a lot of these arguments and to explore some of the very interesting dynamics that have been going on in the past and in the present. So thank you to all of our listeners. Please stay tuned for other AGI events that will be coming up in the coming weeks.
All right. Thank you both. Thank you, Eric and Jeff. It was great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.